Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Review. The book that I have this time is one that is fairly recent. It is Philosophy for Business Leaders, Asking Questions, Navigating Uncertainty, and the Quest for Meaning by Mahmoud Rasmi. And it's fairly new, 2023. This is the book here. It's around 200 pages long, and it's quite an interesting read. So we're going to do our usual examination, looking at the nuts and bolts, talking about some of the main ideas, and then talking about some of the good or bad points. So Dr. Sadler's Honest Reviews, this is a series that I've been doing for quite a while, where I take books very much like this that have to do with philosophy in a very broad sense, so including leadership, ethics, personal development, a lot of other areas as well. This book fits solidly within quite a few of those categories. So let's see what there is to say about this recent work. I always like to begin these reviews by focusing in on three important S's: style, structure, and a summary of the work. So let's talk about style first. This is a very readable book. You don't have to have a big background in philosophy in order to understand the concepts that Rasmi is putting forward. I think he's actually a very good writer. This book probably was honed quite a bit. It's well written. It's using technical vocabulary, but explaining at most points what the terms actually mean. And so I think it's going to be a very useful book for people who don't have much of a background in philosophy, who perhaps had an intro to philosophy class back in college and then forgot it, or have an interest in philosophy but haven't read a lot thus far. Structure, well, it's a very structured work, in part because Rasmi is orienting it at an audience that wants to hit the ground running. So it begins with an introduction that we'll come back to in just a moment. There's three main sections to it. The first section is called The Art of Examining Yourself and Questioning Your Assumptions. So it's focused on that area. And there he's going to bring in Socrates and the Socratic framework of inquiry. That's actually the title of the second chapter. He's going to talk about the trickster archetype and what we can learn from that, and then how to shift our perspectives. The second main part is uncertainty, adversity, and the quest for meaning. That's, in some respects, a little bit shorter. It's got 2 chapters instead of 4 that we have in the first part and 3 in the third part. And he's going to talk a lot about Stoicism there, about understanding uncertainty, what the Stoics in the old days called fortune, what he calls luck here. And then he's going to shift into existentialist philosophy by talking about the quest for meaning. And then in the third and final part of it, it's ethical decision-making frameworks. And he's going to give you a brief introduction to the discipline of ethics and then talk about 3 main ethical or moral theories in a very, very broad sense: virtue ethics, consequentialism, and deontology or duty-based ethics. And then there's a short conclusion to the work. There is a bibliography that is not just where the sources are, but kind of a suggested reading. There's actually a quite interesting longish acknowledgments portion, and then there's a very short blurb about the author himself. And he tells you why 3 parts to this work. And so some portions of this are well worth bringing up and telling you about. So he's going to say that philosophy is helpful, and that's the purpose of this work. It's like a training routine. It's giving you fundamental forms and techniques to exercise mental faculties. And he says the aim of this book is to create a philosophical gymnasium, not with the intention of becoming professional bodybuilders, but to practice the art of examining yourself, developing self-awareness, using the Socratic method to ask more meaningful questions, acquiring skills to cope with stress and uncertainty from a Stoic perspective, and gaining insights into the diverse frameworks of ethical reasoning and decision-making. And then he's going to tell you, here's how I've structured the work. Why is that the case? Well, he says that for business leaders, these are the things I think you need to concentrate on the most. You need to be able to examine yourself and your reasoning processes, your assumptions. You also need to ask yourself better questions. You have to figure out how to understand and deal with uncertainty as well, particularly when it comes to ethical problems. And so why are you going to study some ethical theories? So you've got some tools in your box that you can use. And, in this, Rasmi is going to be introducing you to philosophy, bringing up psychological and sociological and also sort of like personal development literature when helpful, using narratives to try to convey things. Some of these are true stories, some of these are fictional, for example, the movie Office Space. And at the end, in the conclusion, he's going to, again, tell us why he's doing things the way he is. And he said that, I learned it's better to keep things simple and to focus on a clear account that follows a particular storyline that makes the material easier to remember and more compelling. I endeavored to follow a similar path while brainstorming and writing this work. There are topics I could have elaborated on or discussed in more detail, but my aim was to maintain, to the extent possible, an engaging narrative. My main goal has been to present foundational philosophical concepts in a way that's relatable and actionable in both your personal and professional life. So he's contrasting this to his experiences teaching philosophy in classes where he made his students read too much and things got kind of scattered. And I think that's a good approach. And that provides a useful summary of what this book is about as well. This is something, interestingly, that came out of Rasmi teaching people, not just in the ordinary academic classroom, but also in his own classes that he developed and taught online. And he says, I'm a learner for philosophy. I'm giving you the things that I found to be particularly useful and that other people have said are useful as well. So I think that's a decent summary. He's giving you actionable insights drawn from ancient all the way up to contemporary philosophy and psychology that you can apply. Here's one question, though, that we need to ask. So the title is Philosophy for Business Leaders. Do you have to be a business leader in order to benefit from this work? I would say no. I think that this could be useful for all sorts of other readers as well. Let's talk now about some of the key ideas from the work, some of the things that he's engaging with the most. So I would say that the overarching concept is that philosophy, people think that it's very abstract, very academic, very removed from their life, not something for them, particularly if they're involved in business. And Rasmi is saying, no. If you understand it right, if you use it well, it's incredibly applicable to the challenges and problems and dilemmas and issues and even questions that you are going to be running into on a daily basis as a thoughtful person. So I think that's actually something quite good about the work. He's going to say that the goal is to examine frameworks and what he calls mental models. And he says, I'm going to walk you through a handful of these that eminent philosophers adopted, which made them better problem solvers and more effective critical thinkers, and got them better equipped to navigate uncertainty, handle stress, and explore ethical dilemmas. He also says these frameworks are aimed to be a bit helpful, somewhat actionable, and immediately applicable to your personal and professional life, but they're not rigid formulas. There's no checklist. There's no, here's the decision procedure, and this will suit you for everything. This is, you take the ideas and you make them work in your own life. So he says this will provide you with frameworks that will help you navigate problems with a fresh perspective. And I think that's a good way to understand what's going on here. He says that the goal is to cultivate a philosophical mindset rather than have all the answers to everything. And another way of thinking about this that he talks about is cultivating habits. So cultivating habits that have to do with how we approach the matters in front of us, how we ask questions about them, how we shift from one mindset to another. We could go on and on about that. He's also going to talk about, self-awareness and why that's important. Going back to the Delphic maxim, know yourself. Well, what keeps us from actually knowing ourselves? And I'll just give you an example. So he gives you bullet points at certain points. And he tells us, here's potential obstacles: lack of self-reflection, fear of change, avoidance of discomfort, closed-mindedness, fear of and/or lack of feedback, and contentment with the status quo. And then he suggests practical steps that you can take to try to overcome these obstacles. Self-awareness requires knowledge, maintaining a curious mindset, willingness to continuously learn, willingness to question our assumptions, learning how to ask questions, and he frames this as an ongoing feedback process. So that's an important idea. Being able to articulate for ourselves, and this goes not just to the very first part about questions, but to the third part as well about ethics. What is a good life? What should our life look like? What do we need to do in order to foster and develop and protect that? Those are important philosophical questions that we can certainly draw upon as he does in this work. He does have an interesting chapter here about tricksters, and it's an entire chapter. Find and embrace your inner trickster. Why would we want to do that? Well, because like he says, tricksters are disruptors of systems, and tricksters can help us and help other people in a number of different ways, including overcoming the bad side of ego, applying the Socratic method, things like that. He also does discuss what the Socratic method ought to look like. So this is in chapter 2. And he tells us that it's not just simply asking questions. There's a good way to ask questions, and he's going to give us some suggestions about what kinds of questions we want to ask. So here's something that you can take home. Close-ended questions, we want to avoid those and move to open-ended. Go from assumptive to explorative, narrow to broad, single focus to multifaceted, conformity-driven to disruptive. And if we do this, the promise is things are going to go better for us. The part about uncertainty and the second main portion of it, uncertainty, adversity, and the quest for meaning, we have to face a world that is always more uncertain than we realize, and we have to choose and act and commit without having perfect knowledge. So how can we do that well? That's where he harnesses Stoic philosophy to help out with that, but also moves into existentialism. His discussion of existentialism is very focused around Viktor Frankl and logotherapy, but he is going to bring in some other thinkers as well. In fact, he's got a discussion here of Jean-Paul Sartre's novella, Nausea, which is quite interesting here. He brings up William Barrett, who is a historian of philosophy who told us about existentialism, but it is primarily oriented around Viktor Frankl. When it comes to ethics, as I mentioned earlier, he's going to look at three main traditions. First, though, he's going to talk about some other issues, like, well, what is ethics to begin with? Why is it unavoidable? So why do we need to learn how to do it well? He approaches the problem of relativity and relativism and the fact that we do see people disagreeing about ethics. And he's going to say, as many people do, you don't have to pick just one of these, like consequentialism or virtue ethics or deontology. You really want to take considerations from each of them, because that will help you to be a better thinker in the kind of situations that you're going to face. So this is actually what we often call ethical pluralism these days, where you have a multiplicity of approaches. So he's going to introduce you to three that at least put some useful stuff on the table. So those are the main ideas of the work, and you could say, to sum them all up, if you actually study these things, think through them, you're setting yourself on a path of being a better leader, better decision maker, and really a better person. There's a lot of good things to say about this work. I will start by focusing on something that's in the introduction, where he is talking about the breadth of the field of philosophy. So he says, philosophy as a field is too broad. Many different branches tackle diametrically opposing questions. Philosophers often hold differing viewpoints. Just like any other business meeting you've ever been in, the discussions are endless, the topics diverse, the answers seemingly infinite. So that seems to pose kind of a problem. And then he says, there is something many philosophers, not all philosophers, many philosophers have in common. That's what this book will be about, a philosophical mindset. Not a recipe, not, as I said before, a checklist, but rather to promote a approach, a general approach. And I think that's important to bring up. He also, in his discussion of the Socratic method, which is something I've seen a lot of people kind of screw up in their presentation. They're like, well, Socrates went around and he asked a lot of people a lot of questions, and he didn't have any dogmatic assumptions or commitments. He just asked questions and that was it. Well, that's not the whole of the Socratic method. I will say that he doesn't give you the entirety of what you can find Socrates doing in Plato's dialogues, but he does give you a number of important highlights of it. So he talks about the aim of the Socratic method. What is the point of it? It doesn't have just one point. He brings up 6 different things that it's supposed to do. It promotes independent thinking, fosters curiosity, challenges our deeply rooted assumptions and beliefs, encourages thoughtful exchanges, helps us appreciate the complexity of the world around us, and allows us to gain a deeper understanding of the problems and subjects we usually grapple with. So 6 different motivations. He also talks about concrete examples of how to do the Socratic method with 6 different categories of questions. So clarification, what do you mean by X, Y, Z? Challenging assumptions, what's the underlying assumption of your hypothesis? Evidence and reasoning, can you provide supporting evidence to back up your argument? Alternative viewpoints, what other points of view can you think of? Implications and consequences, what are the implications of what you're saying? Challenging the question, What would have been a better question to ask? And each of these, he says, it's good for this kind of situation. So I think that's actually quite helpful for people when they're learning something. You don't want the Socratic method to be presented in too vague and general a way. You also don't want it to be like super, super prescriptive, because then you kind of get away from it. He also has a really great discussion of why winning arguments as an emphasis, as a motivation, can be problematic. And it's in a section called Why Winning an Argument is Useless, More Often Than Not. And so he gives you 6 reasons, again, why winning an argument in certain problems can be futile. He says you become more concerned about the soundness of the argument than the actual point. You fall prey to a kind of dogmatism. You become confined by your arguments even before fully developing them. It becomes dangerous. It leads to endless debates about arguments, missing the point. Attempting to pinpoint the point in an argument becomes fruitless, as others are more interested in refuting the argument than understanding it. And he says this results in an ego clash where everybody strives to prove their intelligence, wit, and philosophical prowesses above others. So this is kind of a good, set of pointers, I would say, here. Later on in his discussion of the Stoics, he's going to have this section on key Stoic principles that I think is pretty good. He talks about the desire for control being the cause of many problems, the need to examine our opinions, beliefs, and judgments, the need to live a virtuous life, right? The 4 cardinal virtues, he mentions those and explains them a little bit. And then he talks about practical applications of Stoicism in pursuit of goals. And he gives you a bunch of practices as well. So, that's a nice short little synopsis there. He's going to also, in the section on navigating uncertainty, he's going to tell us, I mentioned narratives, he's going to tell us a little bit about his own life story in a way that I think is quite good. So this is how he ended up embracing certain aspects of Stoicism. He says, over the span of 7 years in academia, I experienced mounting feelings of frustration, anger, stress, and anxiety due to the precariousness of my job situation. Now, that is the case, by the way, for academics all over the place, right? And it could be the case for people in all sorts of other fields as well. He says, during those 7 years, I believed I'd earned the right to be offered a permanent role at any of the universities where I was teaching in Lebanon. I possessed the necessary prerequisites, including a PhD, teaching experience, and some publications, but this never materialized into a full-time position. I became resentful because in my mind, not securing a job was a terrible thing. I was judging external events over which I had no control as bad things were happening to me. It's not that I wasn't trying to do anything about it. I anxiously yet eagerly tried to find an industry job without any success. I was viewing my situation through a negative lens, lacking mental clarity, clouded by an array of beliefs that were preventing me from taking the proper actions. I was stuck in a vicious circle. And you can go on and read the rest of it if you want. I think this is a great way to teach people. It invites them in. It tells them, I'm not a sage talking down to you. Hey, this is what happened to me as well. I find that very attractive, and I think probably a lot of other readers do as well. He's got, good discussions of existentialism, again, mostly through Viktor Frankl and through values. He talks about 3 ways which we can discover and create meanings in our lives: creative values, experiential values, and attitudinal values, right? And then he tells you what these mean, giving examples over the next pages with some guidelines about how do you actually cultivate these. Later on, he's going to tell us that ethics is complicated. And I actually like this discussion quite a bit. So he says that ethics and morality are not only challenging to define, but complex to contemplate, discuss, and analyze. Why? Well, because they permeate our lives, professions, and nearly everything we do. Ethics operates as a spectrum and a framework that becomes increasingly nuanced as we expand from individuals to families, communities, countries, and the entire world. It also gains complexity as we move across professions, from a small independent business to a family-run enterprise to a small company to a large corporation. So there's a recognition of the importance of variability within ethics and its complexity. You don't want to make it simple, because when you do, you usually screw it up. So I think there's good awareness of that. A little bit later on, he's going to make some interesting distinctions about, for example, in his discussion of ethics with consequentialist ethics, he's going to help us understand the differences between different kinds of consequentialism. He'll do something similar with rule-based ethics and Kantian deontology and the duty-based thing. So these are all good points. I will also say the book is very well laid out. I could see somebody reading through this, thinking about it, and getting a lot out of application to their own life if they haven't been already exposed to these matters. And even for people who already know the theories, the thinkers that have been mentioned in here, it could be useful by way of saying, hey, let's think about this some more. Let's think about this again. Are there any criticisms that could be made of this work? Any things that are problematic? I would say yes. Every work has some things that, depending on what light you look at them, might be not entirely what you want. I will say it could have been a shorter book, not by leaving anything out, but you just look at how it's set up, right? Every paragraph has a break between that paragraph and the next one. So probably if you took out all these paragraph breaks, the book would be a bit shorter. It might make it more readable for some people. For somebody like me, maybe a little bit less enjoyable to read. It doesn't cut down on the readability, but that's a minor quibble. As a matter of fact, most of the things that I have to say are kind of quibbly. For example, in the Catalyst for Change section, there's a discussion of the done-to-death hero's journey. There are so many better narrative constructions than hero's journey that could have been used, I think. The hero's journey has been done to death. It doesn't apply to every kind of story. And I actually think it's more at this point of something that gets in the way than helps illuminate. I also think the discussion of being a trickster risks a certain superficiality. One of the things that needs to be clarified about tricksters is, yes, sometimes they are needed. There's too much seriousness. There's too much everybody thinking the same way. But a lot of times tricksters are not disruptors in a good sense. They're actually disruptors in a bad sense. They get in the way. If somebody is going to be like a professional trickster, you probably don't want them in your company, or you want to keep them over in the corner. So I'm not as big on the emphasis on the trickster. I think that without actually getting things wrong, there's a discussion about different kinds of, working things out, different kinds of reasoning that could be misleading in the logical and creative reasoning, this distinction between analytic, in parentheses, logical and synthetic creative reasoning being a central topic of discussion in philosophy. Well, yes and no. Analytic and synthetic don't always mean the same thing. It would be a mistake to take synthetic as meaning creative and analytic as merely logical. Those don't map onto each other effectively, I would say, even in David Hume, who he brings up here. So that could be a little bit confusing for some readers. There's this interesting reference to This guy Roger L. Martin's book, A New Way to Think, talking about the importance of developing the skill to distinguish between things that cannot be changed due to necessity and things that can be altered through probabilistic approximation. Okay, so that is an important distinction. It is, however, one that goes all the way back to Aristotle, who thematizes it in a number of his works. So not acknowledging that and presenting it as if it's something new, that's, I think a lost opportunity to say, hey, by the way, philosophers have been thinking about this for a long time. The section on Stoicism, I've got mixed feelings about it. One reason is because Rasmi, he's studied Stoic texts, and he's got Marcus Aurelius in the bibliography. But what he's relying on, and the books that he's bringing up, William Irvine's Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, which is okay, but in some respects, not that great. Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way. Nobody who's actually serious about Stoicism takes that book very seriously. Holiday, to be fair, has written better books about Stoicism later on, but that's not a great book. And then Ward Farnsworth, The Practicing Stoic, much more popular, probably a bit more scholarly. It's basically a book of quotes with some prefaces. Unfortunately, I found some of the translations in Farnsworth's books can actually be misleading and off, and there's no way of suggesting that to somebody. So should you be reading those books, or should you be reading, if you're going to read contemporary Stoic books, better Stoic books exist, but you should really be focusing on the ancient Stoics. That's the hallmark if you're going to claim to be doing Stoicism. So that, I think that's problematic. He also uses William Irvine's trichotomy of control, very, very controversial idea within the Stoic community. A lot of people are like, Irvine got this wrong. So it's mentioned in here and actually used without any sort of acknowledgement of the fact that it's probably not the best framework to use. The section on virtue ethics, especially since he had already brought up Stoic virtue in the earlier section, I thought that, okay, it's tough to discuss virtue ethics in an easy-to-digest way. There's some important things that were left out, right? So I think that there's too much just Aristotle in here, not enough acknowledgement of the fact that there's other robust virtue ethics traditions. And, he's got this discussion. Proponents of the theory, like Aristotle, suggest that ideally we ought to do what's virtuous and refrain from acting viciously. The assumption is cultivating a good character is conducive to a society that functions in an orderly, harmonious, and cohesive manner. That's made possible insofar as a community acts virtuously with a view toward achieving the greater common good. So, none of that's wrong. It's just, is that an adequate summary of virtue ethics? I don't think so. It's a lot more complicated than that. And I think only a few more pages would have been needed in order to present a more robust conception of virtue ethics. In the section on consequentialism that I've brought up already, he's going to say that the consequentialist framework includes three main approaches. One is utilitarianism. I think many of us are familiar with that, right? Another is egoism. That's consequentialism that says, I only care about how things affect me. And then the opposite of egoism, altruism, which suggests we should maximize the well-being of others, sometimes at our own expense. And then he says, effective altruism stems from this perspective. Well, utilitarianism also says that. So how is that different from altruism, the way it's being represented here? It's kind of a mistaken presentation that I think could mislead some readers. I'm also not super happy with the deontology discussion because it's effectively set up as, well, you got all sorts of like rules and frameworks like that, and then you have Kant over here. and there's really nothing in between. Like, for example, intuitionist slash pluralist ethics of Ross and Audi. I think there's other better ways to parse out deontology, but these are all sort of philosophers' quibbles. My main worry would be simply that somebody might read these and say, okay, I know all I need to know about these, and then not go on to learn more about them. But if they're understood as merely rudimentary frameworks, then maybe some of these criticisms aren't quite so important. All right, so some final thoughts. I do recommend this book. I think it's good not just for business leaders. I think it's an interesting work. If you're not familiar with all of the different movements, thinkers, approaches that we've discussed, you get a nice overview in these. And it is philosophy for business leaders, but I think this could be useful as philosophy for relationships, philosophy for medical students, philosophy for gardeners. The stuff that Rasmi is bringing up here isn't just for business people or for leaders either. It's it's a nice short work that this might actually be a good introduction to philosophy for somebody who wants to know more about the field and how it could directly connect to their own life. I'm not saying an intro to philosophy textbook, but it could have its benefit in that way. So I'm going to give this a unqualified recommendation and say it's a good book, and why not get it if you have the opportunity.